Sometimes the smallest empty seat can change the rest of your life. That was the thought that crossed my mind as I hurried across the company parking lot on a cool Friday afternoon, balancing an overstuffed backpack over one shoulder while silently hoping the shuttle had not already left without me. Our office organized an annual weekend retreat every fall, giving everyone 2 days away from deadlines, endless meetings, and glowing computer screens. Most of my coworkers had been talking about the trip for weeks, making plans for hiking trails, lakeside bonfires, and board games inside the cabins. I had almost decided not to go. The idea of spending an entire weekend surrounded by people I barely knew sounded exhausting, but my manager insisted it would be good for everyone to disconnect from work for a while. By the time I reached the shuttle, nearly every seat was occupied. Conversations filled the cabin as coworkers laughed, traded snacks, and argued about which playlist should play during the 3-hour drive into the mountains. I stepped inside, glanced down the aisle, and immediately realized there was only one empty seat left. It was beside Nathan Walker. I knew exactly who he was, even though we had exchanged fewer than a dozen words since I joined the company 6 months earlier. Nathan worked in another department, always arrived early, always left on time, and somehow managed to be respected by nearly everyone without ever becoming the loudest person in the room. He was polite, dependable, and impossible to read. Every Monday morning, he carried the first cup of coffee into the office kitchen before anyone else arrived. Every Friday evening, he quietly watered the plants sitting beside the reception desk before heading home. Small habits like those made him familiar without making him approachable. He looked up as I hesitated beside the empty seat. "You can sit here," he said with a calm smile. His voice was warm, softer than I expected. "Thank you," I replied, sliding into the seat while trying not to bump my backpack into the overhead compartment. The shuttle pulled away from the office building moments later. Outside the windows, the familiar streets slowly disappeared behind rows of colorful autumn trees stretching toward the mountains. Inside, conversations continued around us, yet an oddly comfortable silence settled between Nathan and me. He returned to reading a paperback novel resting on his lap while I watched the passing scenery outside, pretending not to notice how peaceful everything suddenly felt. Nearly an hour into the drive, the shuttle stopped at a small roadside cafe where everyone climbed out to stretch their legs. I wandered toward the coffee counter, only to discover I had left my wallet inside my backpack beneath the seat. Before I could turn around, the cashier smiled patiently while Nathan stepped forward beside me. "Add his coffee to mine," he said casually. I immediately reached for my backpack after we returned to the shuttle, offering to pay him back, but he gently shook his head. "You can get the next one," he replied. It was such an ordinary exchange that most people would have forgotten it within minutes. Somehow I did not. As the afternoon sunlight faded into golden evening, the mountains grew closer, their peaks wrapped in drifting clouds. Someone near the front of the shuttle announced there had been a reservation mistake at the lodge. A few cabins now had one room too many while another had one room too few. The coordinator laughed nervously and promised everything would be sorted out after arrival. No one seemed especially concerned. Neither was I, at least, not until she looked down at her clipboard, smiled apologetically, and announced that Nathan Walker and I would be sharing the same lakeside cabin for the entire weekend. The announcement earned a wave of laughter from the rest of the group, followed by the usual jokes about who snored the loudest and who would probably stay awake talking all night. I forced a polite smile even though my thoughts had already begun racing. Sharing a cabin with a coworker I barely knew had never crossed my mind when I packed for this trip. I glanced toward Nathan, expecting at least a hint of frustration, but he simply smiled at the coordinator and said, "Do not worry about it. We will make it work." His calm response somehow made everyone else relax as well. By the time the shuttle reached the lodge, the sun had nearly disappeared behind the mountain ridge, leaving the sky painted in soft shades of orange and purple. The retreat center looked even more beautiful than the brochure had promised. Small wooden cabins surrounded a peaceful lake whose surface reflected the evening sky like polished glass. Tall pine trees framed the property while strings of warm lights stretched between the buildings, creating an atmosphere that felt welcoming instead of extravagant. As everyone collected luggage and room assignments, Nathan effortlessly lifted both of our heavier suitcases from the shuttle compartment before I could offer to help. "I have it," he said with an easy smile. You can grab the backpacks. We followed a narrow stone path toward Cabin 7, one of the smaller lakeside cabins tucked beneath towering evergreens. The moment Nathan unlocked the front door, I quietly let out a breath of relief. The cabin was cozy rather than cramped. A small living room with a fireplace occupied the center, while two separate bedrooms sat on opposite sides of the hallway. The reservation mistake suddenly seemed much less intimidating. Nathan set my suitcase beside one bedroom door. You should take this room, he said. It has the better view of the lake. I blinked in surprise. Are you sure? Absolutely. He shrugged casually. I wake up early anyway. I will not spend much time looking out the window. There was something remarkably effortless about the way he placed other people first without drawing attention to it. After unpacking, we joined the rest of the group near the outdoor pavilion where dinner had already been prepared. Long wooden tables overlooked the water while lanterns cast a warm glow across the gathering. Conversations flowed easily around us as co-workers shared stories from past retreats, but Nathan never tried to become the center of attention. Instead, he quietly noticed little things that everyone else overlooked. When one co-worker accidentally dropped a serving spoon, Nathan picked it up before anyone had to ask. When another guest struggled to carry several trays, he stepped in naturally. None of it looked rehearsed. It simply seemed to be part of who he was. Later that evening, our team leader announced a simple activity. Everyone would pair up for a short walk around the lake before meeting at the bonfire. Since cabin assignments had already determined most partnerships, Nathan and I found ourselves following the winding trail together beneath the first stars of the evening. The air smelled of pine trees and fresh water. Crickets filled the quiet spaces between our footsteps. For several minutes, neither of us spoke, yet the silence felt surprisingly comfortable rather than awkward. Eventually, Nathan looked toward the lake and smiled. You know, he said softly, most people spend trips like this trying to impress everyone around them. He paused for a moment before continuing. I think weekends are better when you stop pretending to be busy. I laughed quietly. I'm still trying to figure out how to stop thinking about work. You will, he replied. It usually takes one sunrise. I looked across the dark water, wondering what he meant. Somehow I had the feeling this weekend was already becoming something very different from the company retreat I thought I had signed up for. The next morning I woke before my alarm to the gentle sound of water brushing against the shore outside my window. For a moment I forgot where I was. Then I opened the curtains and found the lake glowing beneath the first light of sunrise. Thin layers of mist drifted across the surface while the surrounding pine trees stood perfectly still, their reflections stretching across the calm water. Nathan had been right. Something about the morning made it impossible to think about deadlines, unanswered emails, or next week's meetings. I pulled on a light sweater and quietly stepped into the living room. The cabin was empty except for a handwritten note resting beside the coffee maker. Fresh coffee is already brewing. I went down to the dock. No rush. Nathan. I smiled without realizing it. The coffee filled the room with a rich, comforting aroma. After pouring myself a mug, I followed the narrow wooden path leading toward the lake. Nathan sat alone at the end of the dock with his feet hanging over the edge, watching the sunrise without looking at his phone or wearing headphones. He turned when he heard my footsteps. Good morning, he said. I thought you said you always woke up early, I replied. He laughed softly. This is sleeping in for me. I sat beside him, leaving enough space for the quiet to remain comfortable. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. The silence no longer felt unfamiliar. It felt earned. A family of ducks glided slowly across the water while the first rays of sunlight painted the mountains in shades of gold. I come places like this because they remind me how small my problems really are, Nathan finally said. When you spend every day rushing somewhere, you forget that the world keeps moving even when you stop. I looked across the lake, understanding exactly what he meant. I cannot remember the last morning I was not checking messages before getting out of bed. Nathan smiled. Maybe that is why weekends exist. After breakfast, the retreat organizers divided everyone into small groups for outdoor activities. Nathan and I were assigned to the same canoe along with instructions to paddle around the quieter side of the lake before returning for lunch. Neither of us claimed to be an expert, and our first few minutes were filled with awkward laughter as we tried to keep the canoe moving in the same direction. Eventually, we found an easy rhythm. Each paddle stroke became smoother than the last until the only sounds were water rippling beneath us and birds singing from the shoreline. We drifted near a small cove where colorful autumn leaves floated across the surface like tiny boats. Nathan rested his paddle across his lap. "Can we stay here for a minute?" he asked. I nodded. The canoe gently rocked with the water while everything around us seemed to slow down. "What did you always want to do?" he asked quietly. "Before work became your whole life." The question caught me off guard because no one had asked me that in years. I thought for a long moment before answering. I used to paint landscapes. I even considered applying to art school once. Nathan looked genuinely interested. "Why did you stop?" I shrugged with a small laugh. "Life happened. Bills happened. Practical decisions happened." He studied the distant mountains before speaking again. "Dreams do not disappear. Sometimes they just wait until life becomes quiet enough for you to hear them again." His words lingered in my mind long after we paddled back toward shore. That afternoon, the company scheduled free time before dinner. Most people joined volleyball games or explored nearby hiking trails, but Nathan asked if I wanted to help prepare dinner inside the cabin instead. Somehow chopping vegetables together in a small kitchen while soft music played through an old speaker felt more meaningful than any organized activity waiting outside. The warmth of the cabin kitchen made the outside world feel wonderfully distant. Soft music drifted from the small speaker resting beside the window while the scent of fresh herbs, roasted vegetables, and homemade soups slowly filled the room. Nathan moved around the kitchen with quiet confidence, handing me ingredients before I even realized I needed them. We never seemed to get in each other's way. Somehow we naturally found a rhythm, as if we had cooked together many times before instead of only meeting outside the office a handful of times. "You cut vegetables much better than I expected," Nathan teased with an easy smile. I laughed. That almost sounded like a compliment. It was a compliment. He looked down at the cutting board before adding, "I just wanted to make you work for it." We both laughed, and the sound echoed comfortably through the cabin. It was surprising how quickly awkwardness had disappeared. The silence that once separated us had been replaced by small conversations that seemed to arrive without effort. After dinner, we carried our mugs of hot chocolate onto the wooden porch overlooking the lake. The temperature had dropped noticeably, and a cool breeze gently stirred the tops of the pine trees surrounding the shoreline. Across the water, lights from other cabins shimmered softly against the dark surface, while distant laughter drifted through the evening air from coworkers gathered around the community bonfire. Neither of us felt any hurry to join them. We sat quietly in two wooden rocking chairs, wrapped in light blankets provided by the lodge. After several peaceful minutes, Nathan's phone vibrated on the small table beside him. He glanced at the screen and immediately answered. His voice softened in a way I had not heard before. "Hi, Mom." "Yes, everything is going well." I tried not to listen, turning my attention toward the lake instead. Even so, a few words naturally reached me through the quiet evening. Nathan gently reminded someone to take evening medication, asked whether dinner had gone well, and promised he would call again the following morning before breakfast. There was patience in every sentence, never a trace of obligation. When the call ended, he placed the phone back on the table and smiled apologetically. "I hope I did not interrupt the peace." "Not at all," I replied. "Your family sounds lucky to have you." Nathan looked toward the lake before answering. "It is mostly my mother and my grandfather now. My grandfather has needed extra help over the past couple of years, so weekends usually belong to them." I remembered coworkers occasionally mentioning that Nathan rarely accepted invitations after work, always finding polite reasons to head home instead. Until now, I had assumed he simply preferred being alone. Instead, I realized he had quietly been giving his time to the people who needed him most. "Do you ever get tired?" I asked. He smiled thoughtfully. "Sometimes. But taking care of people you love does not feel like losing time. It feels like spending it where it matters." His answer stayed with me long after our conversation drifted toward lighter topics. Later that night, light rain began falling across the lake, tapping gently against the cabin roof in a slow, comforting rhythm. We moved inside and settled near the fireplace, each reading a different book while the fire crackled softly between us. The peaceful silence felt different now. It no longer belonged to two coworkers sharing a cabin because of a reservation mistake. It belonged to two people slowly discovering pieces of each other's lives that had remained invisible inside the office. As I turned another page, Nathan's phone lit up once more with a message preview that briefly appeared on the screen before fading away. I was not trying to read it, but one sentence caught my attention by accident. "Thank you for always putting everyone else before yourself." I looked up instinctively, but Nathan had already turned the phone face down without saying a word. In that quiet moment, I realized there was still a great deal about him I did not know. And somehow the person who seemed the most composed on the outside might also be carrying the heaviest responsibilities in silence. The rain continued long after midnight, wrapping the cabin in a peaceful rhythm that made sleep come easily. When I opened my eyes the next morning, the sky outside had turned a soft silver, with clouds drifting lazily above the lake. The retreat schedule had originally included a long hiking trip, but the steady rain forced the organizers to cancel every outdoor activity until further notice. Instead, everyone was encouraged to spend the day relaxing inside the cabins, reading, playing games, or simply enjoying the quiet atmosphere. For most people, it sounded like an unexpected inconvenience. For Nathan and me, it somehow felt like an unexpected gift. After making breakfast together, we carried our coffee into the living room and settled near the fireplace. The crackling fire filled the silence while raindrops traced slow patterns across the large windows facing the lake. I picked up the novel I had brought for the trip, but after reading the same page 3 times, I realized I had not absorbed a single sentence. Nathan noticed my distracted expression and smiled. "Your mind is somewhere else." I laughed quietly. "Is it that obvious?" He nodded. "Only because mine usually does the same thing." We sat quietly for another few minutes before he reached toward a wooden cabinet beside the fireplace and pulled out an old board game left behind for guests. "We could pretend we are very competitive," he suggested. "I have a feeling I would lose." "You probably would," I replied, smiling. The hours passed almost without us noticing. We played games, made grilled cheese sandwiches for lunch, and listened to the rain while talking about everything except work. We discovered that we both loved classic bookstores, preferred quiet coffee shops over crowded restaurants, and always chose mountain vacations instead of busy beaches. Every new conversation uncovered another unexpected similarity. It became increasingly difficult to believe we had spent 6 months working in the same company while barely speaking to each other. By late afternoon, the rain became heavier, turning the lake into a sheet of rippling gray beneath the darkening sky. The lights flickered once before the power quietly disappeared throughout the cabin. A few seconds later, only the fireplace continued filling the room with warm orange light. Nathan lit several candles from a small emergency kit stored in the kitchen drawer, placing them carefully around the room until gentle shadows danced across the wooden walls. The cabin suddenly felt even more peaceful than before. Without television, internet, or bright lights competing for attention, conversation became the only thing left to share. Nathan leaned back in his chair, watching the fire for a long moment before speaking. "Can I tell you something I do not usually tell people?" I looked at him with quiet curiosity and nodded. He took a slow breath. "When I was younger, I thought success meant becoming someone everyone admired. Bigger job, bigger house, more achievements." His smile carried a touch of sadness. "Then my father became seriously ill. Everything changed almost overnight." The fire crackled softly between us as he continued. I realized none of those things mattered nearly as much as simply being present for the people waiting at home. His voice never trembled, yet every word carried the weight of lived experience. After he passed away, I promised myself I would never become too busy to answer a phone call from someone I loved. I listened without interrupting. There was nothing I could say that would make his memories lighter. Instead, I quietly admitted something I had never shared with a coworker before. I think I have been afraid of slowing down because I worried I would discover I was building a life that did not actually make me happy. Nathan looked at me with understanding instead of surprise. "Sometimes," he said gently, "the bravest decision is not changing your life overnight. It is allowing yourself to imagine a different one." Outside, the rain finally began to soften, leaving only a quiet whisper against the windows. Sitting there beside the fire, surrounded by candlelight and comfortable silence, I realized this conversation would remain with me long after the weekend itself became a memory. Sunday morning arrived with the sky washed clean by the night's rain. Sunlight filtered through the pine trees, scattering golden reflections across the quiet lake outside our cabin. The retreat center slowly came back to life as co-workers wandered toward the dining hall carrying coffee mugs and sharing stories about the unexpected storm. Everything looked brighter than it had 2 days earlier, yet I could not shake the feeling that time was moving much too quickly. By lunchtime we would begin packing, and before evening we would be back on the highway toward the city, returning to calendars, deadlines, and routines that suddenly felt much farther away than only a weekend. Nathan stepped onto the porch carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee and handed one to me without asking how I liked it. Somehow he already knew. We stood side by side watching sunlight dance across the lake, while a gentle breeze carried the scent of wet pine through the air. "It feels different today," I said quietly. Nathan nodded. "Because now we know it is almost over." There was no sadness in his voice, only quiet honesty. After breakfast, the organizers announced that the hiking trails had finally reopened now that the weather had cleared. Small groups scattered across the retreat grounds, eager to enjoy the final hours before departure. Nathan asked whether I wanted to take one last walk before everyone returned to pack. I agreed immediately. The trail climbed gently through tall evergreens before opening onto a scenic overlook where the entire valley stretched beneath us. The lake shimmered below like polished glass, while distant cabins looked almost small enough to fit in the palm of a hand. We leaned against the wooden observation railing without speaking. Sometimes silence between the right people became its own conversation. After several minutes, Nathan reached into the pocket of his jacket and removed a small folded piece of paper. He smiled almost nervously before handing it to me. "I have been carrying this since the first day." I unfolded it carefully. Inside was a printed employee directory from our company with dozens of names listed alphabetically. My name had been circled in blue ink. I looked at him with complete confusion. Nathan let out a quiet breath. I probably should explain that before it looked strange. He laughed softly, and I found myself smiling too. "When you joined the company 6 months ago, Human Resources asked me to help welcome new employees because I had been there the longest in our department. I noticed your name before your first day." He paused, searching for the right words. "Then I saw one of your paintings." I frowned slightly. "My painting?" "The landscape hanging outside conference room B." Suddenly everything made sense. Months earlier, the company had hosted a small employee art display, and one of my old landscape paintings had been selected almost by accident after a coworker encouraged me to submit it. I had nearly forgotten it was still hanging there. Nathan smiled toward the mountains in the distance. Most people walked past it without stopping. I stood there for nearly 15 minutes after work one evening. I remember thinking whoever painted that picture understood quiet in the same way I did. My heart skipped unexpectedly. "Why did you never say anything?" He looked down at the folded paper still resting in my hands. "Because I kept convincing myself there would always be a better time." Then weeks became months. A gentle breeze stirred the trees around us while neither of us moved. Finally, I laughed softly. "So we spent half a year saying almost nothing because both of us were waiting for the perfect moment." Nathan smiled with quiet embarrassment. "Apparently." I folded the paper again and carefully slipped it into my jacket pocket. "Maybe perfect moments do not arrive," I said. "Maybe they are. Simply the ones we almost miss." Nathan looked at me with the same calm warmth I had come to know throughout the weekend, and together we started walking back toward the cabins, both silently realizing that whatever had begun here could not be left behind in the mountains when the shuttle finally carried everyone home. Packing took far less time than I expected, yet every folded shirt and zipped suitcase somehow felt like another reminder that the weekend was slipping away. Around noon, the retreat center slowly filled with the sounds of rolling luggage, closing cabin doors, and coworkers exchanging promises to share photos once everyone returned home. The relaxed atmosphere from the previous 2 days remained, but there was also a quiet sense of reluctance hanging in the air, as though no one was quite ready to leave the peaceful mountains behind. Nathan and I carried our bags toward the waiting shuttle without speaking very much. We no longer needed conversation to fill every silence. Some moments felt complete simply because we experienced them together. When we reached the parking area, I noticed that almost everyone had already chosen seats. Once again, there was only one empty place beside Nathan. This time I smiled before he even looked up. "Looks familiar," I said. He laughed softly. "Maybe the shuttle likes making decisions for us." I settled into the seat beside him just as the engine started. As the retreat center slowly disappeared behind the pine trees, I found myself looking back through the window much longer than I expected. Nathan noticed. "You are already planning to come back someday." It was not a question. "I think I am," I admitted. "Just maybe not with an entire office." We both laughed, and the sound felt lighter than it had on Friday afternoon. The drive home unfolded quietly. Some co-workers slept against the windows while others sorted through photographs on their phones. Nathan spent part of the trip reading his novel before eventually closing the book and simply watching the mountains pass by. About halfway through the drive, the shuttle stopped at the same roadside cafe where he had bought my coffee 2 days earlier. This time I stepped inside before he had the chance. When he reached the counter, I handed the cashier my card with a smile. "I believe I owe someone a coffee." Nathan looked amused. "You remembered. You told me I could get the next one." I handed him the warm cup. "I do pay my debts." He accepted it with a grateful smile that somehow meant much more than the coffee itself. Back on the shuttle, we continued talking about ordinary things that suddenly seemed unusually important. Favorite bookstores, small mountain towns worth visiting, family recipes, music we listened to during long drives. At one point, Nathan looked toward me with quiet curiosity. "Do you still paint?" I hesitated before answering. "Not really." He nodded thoughtfully. "I hope you start again." His words were simple, yet they carried the same quiet encouragement that had followed every conversation we shared throughout the weekend. As the city skyline gradually appeared in the distance, phones began reconnecting to mobile networks. Notification sounds echoed throughout the shuttle as messages, emails, and calendar reminders flooded everyone's screens. I instinctively reached for my own phone before stopping halfway. For the first time in months, none of those alerts felt urgent. Nathan glanced at the growing list of notifications on his screen before calmly locking it again and slipping it into his pocket. "They can wait another hour," he said with an easy smile. I realized I felt exactly the same way. The shuttle finally pulled into the company parking lot just before sunset. Co-workers gathered their belongings, exchanged goodbyes, and gradually disappeared toward their cars. Within minutes, the busy parking lot became surprisingly quiet. Nathan placed his travel bag over one shoulder while I adjusted my backpack. For a brief moment, neither of us moved. The weekend had officially ended, yet neither of us seemed ready to let the conversation end with it. Nathan smiled gently. "I guess this is where normal life starts again." I looked at him for a long second before answering. "Only if we let it." Something hopeful crossed his expression. The silence that followed no longer felt uncertain. It felt like the beginning of a decision that neither of us had spoken aloud, yet both of us already understood. For the next few days, the office looked exactly as it always had. Computer screens glowed beneath bright ceiling lights, coffee machines hummed in the break room, and meetings filled every calendar with familiar routines. Yet everything felt subtly different to me. The same hallways that once seemed ordinary now carried quiet reminders of conversations beside the lake, peaceful mornings on the dock, and candlelight reflected across wooden cabin walls. Every time I passed the landscape painting hanging outside Conference Room B, I found myself slowing down for a moment. I wondered whether Nathan had stood in that exact spot months earlier, quietly studying the brushstrokes without knowing we would someday spend an unforgettable weekend together. Late Wednesday afternoon, I walked into the office kitchen to refill my coffee mug. Nathan was already there watering the same small plants beside the window, just as he had every Friday before the trip. He looked up and smiled. "Good timing." "For coffee?" I asked. "For conversation," he answered. We carried our mugs to a quiet table near the window overlooking the city. Outside, traffic flowed endlessly through the streets below, yet somehow the noise felt distant. "How has the week been?" Nathan asked. I laughed softly. "Busy enough to remind me why the mountains felt so peaceful." He nodded knowingly. "I had the same thought yesterday." For a few moments, we simply watched people crossing the sidewalks beneath us. Then Nathan reached into his pocket and placed a small folded brochure on the table between us. It was from the same mountain lodge where our company retreat had taken place. "I stopped by the travel desk during lunch," he explained. "They offer weekend reservations throughout the year." I looked at him curiously. "You were thinking about going back?" He smiled with a quiet honesty that had become so familiar. "I was hoping you might want to." I picked up the brochure and turned it over slowly. The photograph on the front showed the lake glowing beneath an early morning sunrise, almost identical to the one we had watched together. Before I realized what I was doing, I heard myself asking, "When were you thinking?" Nathan did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked at me with the same calm expression he had worn the first time he invited me to sit beside him on the shuttle. "Whenever life starts feeling too loud again," he said, "we do not need a special occasion." His answer made me smile more than I expected. That sounds like a very good reason. The following Saturday morning, we met outside a neighborhood bookstore instead of the office. There were no coworkers, no schedules, and no organized activities waiting for us. We wandered through shelves filled with old novels, shared recommendations, and laughed whenever one of us discovered a favorite childhood book. Afterward, we found a quiet coffee shop overlooking a small city park. Hours passed almost unnoticed as we talked about family traditions, childhood dreams, favorite places to watch sunsets, and the surprising ways a single weekend could change the direction of ordinary days. At one point, I admitted that I had unpacked my old painting supplies earlier that week for the first time in years. Nathan's smile widened with unmistakable pride. "Have you started yet?" "Not yet," I answered honestly, "but I cleaned every brush." He lifted his coffee cup slightly, as though making a quiet toast. "Sometimes preparing to begin is the beginning." His words stayed with me all afternoon. As the sun slowly lowered beyond the city skyline, we stepped outside and walked through the park beneath rows of turning autumn leaves. Nothing dramatic happened. There were no grand speeches or impossible promises. Only two people choosing not to allow an unexpected connection to disappear after returning home. For the first time in a very long while, the future no longer felt like something I needed to race toward. It felt like something worth walking into one peaceful step at a time, and Nathan was still walking beside me. Several weeks passed, yet the quiet changes that began during those 2 days never faded. They settled gently into everyday life, transforming ordinary moments in ways I never expected. My old painting supplies no longer collected dust inside the closet. Every Sunday afternoon, I opened the windows of my apartment, placed a blank canvas on the easel, and slowly rediscovered a part of myself I thought had disappeared years earlier. The first landscape I completed after so much time showed a peaceful mountain lake beneath the early light of sunrise. I did not need to explain why I chose that scene. Nathan understood the moment he saw it. He stood quietly in my apartment, studying every brushstroke with the same patient attention he had once given the painting outside Conference Room B. After a long silence, he smiled. I knew it would come back. I laughed softly. Maybe it was only waiting for the right weekend. He nodded. Or the right reminder. Life continued moving forward, but we stopped allowing it to rush past us unnoticed. We created small traditions that gradually became the best parts of every week. Wednesday evenings belonged to a neighborhood bookstore where we always left carrying more novels than we originally planned to buy. Saturday mornings began with coffee from the same quiet cafe overlooking the park before wandering through local farmers markets or nearby walking trails. Every month, we chose one place we had never visited before, proving to ourselves that meaningful adventures did not require expensive vacations or perfect timing. Sometimes they only required deciding to go. At work, our coworkers slowly noticed the difference. They often smiled when they found us eating lunch together or discussing books in the break room, but no one questioned it very much. To everyone else, we simply looked like two colleagues who had become close friends after a company retreat. Only Nathan and I understood how many quiet conversations, peaceful silences, and honest moments had quietly built that connection. One crisp autumn afternoon, our manager announced another company retreat would be scheduled the following year at the same mountain lodge. The room immediately filled with excited conversations as people discussed hiking trails and cabin assignments. Nathan glanced across the conference table toward me with an amused smile. I could not help smiling back. Later, that day, while walking toward the parking lot after work, he asked, "Do you think they will make another reservation mistake?" I laughed. "I think they will probably organize everything perfectly this time." He nodded thoughtfully. "That is probably true." After a brief pause, he added with a grin, "Then we should make our own reservation before they have the chance." We both laughed, already knowing the answer before either of us said another word. A few months later, we returned to the same lakeside cabin on our own. The dock was exactly where we remembered it. The pine trees still reflected across the calm water. Even the old rocking chairs remained on the porch waiting beneath the evening sky. As the sun slowly disappeared behind the mountains, we carried 2 mugs of coffee down to the end of the dock and sat together in comfortable silence. Nothing about the place had really changed. The difference was us. I thought back to the nervous person who had stepped onto a company shuttle believing he was simply attending another work event. I remembered hesitating beside the last empty seat, never imagining that such an ordinary decision could quietly reshape the direction of my life. Nathan looked across the peaceful lake before turning toward me with the same calm smile that had welcomed me from the very beginning. "Funny how one empty seat started all of this," he said. I smiled as the first stars slowly appeared above the mountains. "Maybe some journeys never begin with grand plans," I replied. "Maybe they begin with the courage to sit beside someone you have not met yet." The lake reflected the evening sky as perfectly as it had on that unforgettable morning, and for the first time in a very long while, I understood that the most meaningful destinations are not always places marked on a map. Sometimes they are simply the people who quietly make every ordinary day feel like coming home.